They told me to stay in the family readiness group. Said my job was care packages and prayer circles, not combat operations. Just another military wife whose husband deployed while she kept the home fires burning. That was before the compound went dark. Before 50 enemy combatants barricaded themselves with hostages. Before command realized the only person who could get inside was someone they'd never taken seriously. Someone they'd spent 3 years telling to stick to bake sales and support meetings. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Vasquez, and for 3 years I'd been invisible at Forward Operating Base Meridian. Not because I was trying to hide, but because when you're a 34-year-old mother of 2 whose husband is deployed with the Rangers, the assumption is that your only value comes from keeping other military wives organized and their morale up. The assumption is that your 16 years of military intelligence training before you had kids doesn't matter anymore. The assumption is that once you become a mom, you stop being anything else that might be useful when things go sideways. I'd learned to accept it, mostly. The sideways glances when I mentioned my previous clearance levels. The polite dismissals when I offered tactical insights during briefings I wasn't supposed to understand. The way conversations stopped when I entered rooms where real decisions were being made. It was easier to focus on Emma and Carlos, my 8- and 6-year-old, and count down the days until Miguel came home from his deployment in Syria. The base childcare center had become my second home. Every morning at 0630, I'd drop off the kids and then head to the Family Readiness Group office, where my official duties included organizing care packages, coordinating spouse communications, and maintaining morale among the other military families. Unofficially, my duties included pretending I didn't notice when Major Davidson and his staff discussed classified operations within earshot, pretending I didn't recognize tactical patterns in their deployment schedules, and pretending I didn't understand the significance of the equipment requisitions that crossed my desk. The truth was, I understood all of it. Before Emma was born, I'd spent 8 years as a signals intelligence analyst with a TS/SSCI clearance and specialized training in Middle Eastern terror networks. Before Carlos came along, I'd been the primary analyst for Operation Sandstorm, where my pattern recognition had identified 3 separate bombing plots before they reached operational status. Before I became Miguel's wife, I'd been Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez, and I'd been good at my job in ways that had nothing to do with organizing potluck dinners. But that was before, now as a spouse, a mother, a support system. Now my job was to smile at briefings where they explained concepts I'd helped develop, nod sympathetically when other wives complained about deployments I understood better than most senior officers, and keep my mouth shut when I spotted inconsistencies in intelligence reports that were accidentally left on tables where I might see them. The morning everything changed started like every other morning for the past 3 years. Emma woke up crying because she'd had another nightmare about Daddy not coming home. Carlos refused to eat breakfast because he'd decided he was too old for cereal but too young for coffee. I managed to get them both dressed, fed, and out the door by 0615, which was some kind of personal record. The base felt different that morning, though I couldn't put my finger on why. There was tension in the air that had nothing to do with the usual deployment stress. More vehicles than normal at the command center. More personnel moving with the kind of purpose that meant something significant was happening. As I walked past the intelligence building on my way to drop off the kids, I noticed lights in windows that were usually dark at this hour. At the child care center, Mrs. Patterson looked more harried than usual. She was a civilian contractor who'd been running the facility for over a decade, and nothing usually rattled her. But today she kept checking her phone and glancing toward the main gate. "Everything okay?" I asked as Emma ran off to find her favorite toys. "Oh, you know how it is," she said. But her smile didn't reach her eyes. Just one of those days where everyone seems a little on edge. I knew the feeling. After dropping off Carlos with his age group, I walked toward the FRG office but took a detour past the communications building, not because I was trying to eavesdrop, but because it was on the way, and I'd learned to pay attention to patterns. What I saw made me slow my pace. 3 Humvees with communications equipment I recognized from my intelligence days. Personnel moving equipment that looked like they were setting up a forward command post. And through the windows of the intelligence building, I could see people hunched over screens displaying what looked like real-time satellite feeds. Something was happening. Something big enough to require additional communication assets and extended intelligence monitoring. Something that had the entire base leadership working at 0630 on a Tuesday morning. I made it to the FRG office by 0700, where I found Linda Morrison already at her desk, looking more stressed than I'd seen her since her husband deployed 6 months ago. Linda was the FRG leader, a position that came with slightly more official recognition than mine, but essentially the same duties. She was a good person, but she'd never served herself, so she didn't recognize the signs I was seeing. "Elena, thank goodness you're here," she said without looking up from her computer. "I've been getting calls since 0500 from spouses, asking if their husbands' units are okay. Apparently, something happened overnight, but nobody's telling us anything official." I sat down at my desk and logged into the computer system I used for administrative tasks. The screen showed the usual array of family support resources, event calendars, and morale-building materials. But I also had access to some basic personnel rosters, deployment schedules, and contact information that gave me a broader view of base operations than most people realized. "What kind of calls?" I asked, already pulling up duty rosters and deployment schedules. "Mostly wives of the 3rd Battalion guys. They're saying their husband's last check-in was supposed to be at 2,200 hours yesterday, but nobody heard anything. And Sarah Martinez said her husband texted her at 2030 that they were moving to a new position, but then nothing." I felt that familiar tingle at the base of my skull. The same sensation I used to get when intelligence patterns started forming connections that weren't immediately obvious. The 3rd Battalion had been conducting routine patrols in the Kandahar province for the past 2 months. Routine patrols with predictable check-in schedules and standard operational parameters. Except nothing about this morning felt routine. "Let me make some calls," I said, reaching for the secure phone line that connected the FRG office to various administrative departments. It wasn't supposed to be used for operational inquiries, but I'd learned over the years that information flowed through unofficial channels more freely than official ones. My first call was to the duty officer at the communications center. Master Sergeant Williams had been helpful in the past when families needed information about delayed communications or technical problems that affected morale calls home. "Williams. Master Sergeant, this is Elena Vasquez from the FRG office. We're getting some concerned calls from families about missed check-ins last night. Is there anything we can tell them about communication delays or technical issues?" There was a pause that lasted 3 seconds too long. "Ma'am, I'd recommend you contact the family liaison officer for any questions about operational communications." That was not the answer Williams normally gave. Usually, he'd either explain the technical issue or confirm that there weren't any problems. The formal redirect told me 2 things. First, that there was something to redirect from, and second, that it was significant enough to require official channels. My second call was to the base medical facility. If there had been casualties, the medical staff would be on heightened alert, even if they couldn't share specific information. "Base Medical, this is Captain Rodriguez." "Captain, this is Elena Vasquez from FRG. We're checking on whether there are any general medical alerts or preparedness levels that might affect family notifications today." Another pause. "Mrs. Vasquez, all medical status inquiries need to go through official family notification procedures. 2 formal redirects in 5 minutes." Whatever had happened, it was serious enough that standard operating procedures had been activated. Personnel who normally provided informal updates to family support staff had been instructed to refer everything through official channels. I hung up and looked at Linda, who was watching me with growing concern. "What's wrong?" she asked. "I'm not sure yet," I said. But I was starting to form a hypothesis. "Let me try one more call." This time, I called the base intelligence office directly. It was a violation of protocol for a family support staff member to contact intelligence personnel, but I knew someone who might be willing to bend the rules if the situation warranted it. Technical Sergeant Maria Santos had been a friend during my active duty days. We'd worked together on Operation Sandstorm, and she'd been one of the few people who'd understood when I'd made the decision to transition to spouse status. If anyone would give me an honest answer about what was happening, it would be Maria. "Base Intelligence, Technical Sergeant Santos. Maria, it's Elena. I need to ask you something off the record." "Elena?" Her voice shifted immediately from professional to concerned. "What's going on?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out. I'm getting calls from families about missed communications, and everyone I talk to is giving me official runarounds. Is there something I should know about? The pause this time lasted 10 seconds. When Maria spoke again, her voice was carefully controlled. Elena, I can't discuss operational matters, but I can tell you that if families are concerned about communications, they should be prepared for possible delays in normal contact schedules. Prepared for delays. That was intelligence speak for something has gone wrong, but we don't know how wrong yet. Maria, are our people safe? Elena. Another pause. Just make sure the families know that no news doesn't necessarily mean bad news, but also make sure they're prepared for whatever official information might come through today. She hung up before I could ask anything else, but she told me everything I needed to know. Something had happened to the 3rd Battalion. Something serious enough to disrupt communication schedules and activate formal notification procedures. Something that had the intelligence staff working overtime and everyone else walking on eggshells. I spent the next hour fielding increasingly frantic calls from spouses who'd started calling each other and comparing notes. By 0900, I had a clear picture of what wasn't being said officially. The entire 3rd Battalion had gone dark sometime after 2,200 hours the previous night. No routine check-ins, no status updates, no administrative communications that usually flowed through the system automatically. 47 soldiers, including my husband Miguel, had simply stopped communicating with the outside world. At 0930, my phone rang with a call that changed everything. FRG office, Elena speaking. Mrs. Vasquez, this is Colonel Harrison. I need you to report to the command center immediately. Colonel Harrison was the base commander. In 3 years of living at Forward Meridian, I'd never spoken to him directly. The fact that he was calling me personally, rather than going through Linda or the official family liaison channels, meant that whatever was happening had moved beyond standard procedures. Yes, sir. Should I bring anything specific? Just yourself. And Mrs. Vasquez? This conversation doesn't happen until you get here. The walk from the FRG office to the command center took exactly 4 minutes, but it felt like the longest 4 minutes of my life. Every possible scenario ran through my mind, each one worse than the last. Mass casualty event, equipment failure, enemy action, prisoner capture. The fact that they were calling me specifically, rather than just activating standard family notification procedures, suggested that whatever had happened required something beyond the normal response protocols. The command center was buzzing with activity. Personnel I didn't recognize working at stations that weren't normally staffed, multiple secure communication lines active simultaneously, and in the center of it all, Colonel Harrison standing over a table covered with maps, satellite photos, and intelligence reports. He looked up when I entered, and I saw something in his expression that made my stomach drop. It wasn't grief, which would have meant casualties. It wasn't anger, which would have meant enemy action. It was something worse, uncertainty. Mrs. Vasquez, thank you for coming. I need to ask you some questions about your background. Not about Miguel. Not about the 3rd Battalion. About my background. Sir, your military record shows 8 years as a signals intelligence analyst with specialized training in Middle Eastern terror networks. Is that accurate? Yes, sir. Your clearance was TS/SCI with access to compartmentalized programs related to insurgent communication patterns and organizational structures? Yes, sir. I felt my heart rate increasing. They wouldn't be asking about my clearance unless they needed something that fell within my area of expertise. Mrs. Vasquez, your husband's unit went dark at 2,147 hours last night during a routine patrol in the Kandahar province. We've had no communication since then, but satellite imagery shows their convoy vehicle stationary at a compound approximately 15 kilometers from their last known position. He turned to the table and pointed at a satellite photo that showed a cluster of buildings surrounded by walls and what looked like defensive positions. The compound is not on any of our facility databases. It appears to have been constructed recently, within the past 6 months. Intelligence analysis suggests it's being used as a safe house or staging area by an unknown group. I studied the photo and immediately saw patterns that made my intelligence training kick into gear. The layout of the building suggested defensive positioning designed to control access points. The wall construction looked professional, not improvised. The vehicle placement around the perimeter indicated organized security procedures. Sir, This looks like a military or paramilitary facility, not a typical insurgent safe house. That's our assessment as well. But here's where it gets complicated. He pulled out another photograph, this one taken from a different angle. Thermal imaging shows approximately 50 heat signatures inside the compound. But only 12 of those signatures match the profile for adult males. I felt the pieces clicking together in my mind. 50 heat signatures, 12 adults. That meant 38 women and children inside a fortified compound with my husband's patrol. They're being held hostage. That's our working assumption. But it gets worse. Colonel Harrison pulled out a communication transcript. At 0300 hours this morning, we received a transmission on an emergency frequency. Single message. English. Professional voice quality. He handed me the transcript, and I read it twice before the full implications sank in. American patrol secure. 38 local civilians also present. No harm will come to any personnel if compound remains undisturbed. Any rescue attempt will result in total casualties. No negotiations. No contact. Condition unchanged until further notice. I looked up at Colonel Harrison. They're using the women and children as human shields. Yes, and because of the mixed hostage situation, standard assault protocols are not viable. We can't risk civilian casualties, but we also can't establish communication to negotiate release terms. What do you need from me, sir? Colonel Harrison was quiet for a moment, studying my face as if trying to decide how much to trust me with. Mrs. Vasquez, the intelligence we've gathered suggests that whoever is holding our people has sophisticated knowledge of American military procedures. They knew exactly how to cut off communications without triggering automatic alerts. They chose a compound that's positioned to make aerial assault extremely difficult. And their message was crafted to exploit our rules of engagement regarding civilian casualties. You think they have inside information? I think they've been planning this for months. And I think they specifically targeted the 3rd Battalion because they knew something about the unit's operational patterns that outsiders shouldn't know. I felt that familiar sensation again, the pattern recognition that had made me valuable as an intelligence analyst. There was something here that didn't fit the standard profile of opportunistic hostage-taking. Sir, may I see the full intelligence package on this compound? He gestured to a chair beside the table. That's why you're here, Mrs. Vasquez. We need someone with your analytical background to help us understand what we're dealing with. Someone who can think like the intelligence analyst you used to be. For the first time in 3 years, someone was asking me to use the skills that had defined me before I became a wife and mother. Someone was treating me like the professional I'd been, rather than just the support system I'd become. I spent the next hour reviewing everything they had. Satellite imagery, communication intercepts, personnel files, operational reports from the past 6 months. And slowly, a picture began to emerge that was more complex and more dangerous than anyone had realized. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. So you made contact with the facility administrators? We made contact with Dr. Amara Okafor, the woman who's been running this place for 18 months. Elena, what she told us changed everything we thought we knew about this region. Before Miguel could continue, a woman approached us from across the courtyard. She was in her 40s, wearing clothes that marked her as civilian, but carrying herself with the authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. Her English was accented but precise, and her eyes held the kind of exhaustion that comes from months of constant vigilance. You must be Elena. Your husband has told us about your intelligence background. I am Dr. Okafor. I shook her hand, noting the calluses that suggested manual labor alongside administrative work. Doctor, I need to understand what's happening here. My analysis suggests this facility has been deliberately hidden from official databases. Hidden, yes, but not for the reasons your military might assume. She gestured for me to follow her toward one of the residential buildings. Come. Let me show you why your husband chose to violate his orders rather than abandon us. As we walked, Dr. Okafor explained the history that had led to this moment. The facility had been established using private funding to provide care for children who had been displaced by regional conflicts. Not refugees in the traditional sense, but children whose parents had been killed or disappeared during military operations that were too sensitive for official acknowledgement. These children are not enemy combatants, Mrs. Vasquez, but they are the children of people who were designated as enemies by various governments. Their parents were intelligence operatives, military contractors, political dissidents, or simply civilians who possessed information that made them targets. We entered a building where children ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers were engaged in evening activities. Some were reading, others were drawing, and a few were playing quiet games supervised by adults who were clearly trained caregivers. The scene looked remarkably normal, except for the tension that hung in the air like smoke. Dr. Okafor, how many children are currently in your care? 50 children from 12 different countries. All of them officially dead according to government records. All of them very much alive and in need of protection. 50 children. The number hit me like a physical blow as I realized the true scope of what Miguel and his team had stumbled into. These weren't just displaced persons. These were children whose existence had been erased by intelligence agencies that found it convenient to eliminate entire families rather than deal with security complications. And someone found out about this facility? 3 weeks ago, we intercepted communications suggesting that several intelligence agencies had discovered our location. The children in our care represent loose ends from operations spanning the past 5 years. Operations that officially never happened, conducted by people who officially never existed. I felt the intelligence analyst in me processing implications that were staggering in scope. If Dr. Okafor was correct, then this facility was housing children whose continued existence could expose classified operations conducted by multiple governments. The threat they faced wasn't from random terrorists or insurgent groups. It was from professional intelligence operatives who had been tasked with eliminating evidence. Dr. Okafor, are you telling me that government agencies are planning to kill children to protect operational security? Her expression was grim. I am telling you that children have already been killed for exactly that reason. This facility exists because we managed to extract 50 of them before similar elimination operations could be completed. The weight of what she was saying settled over me with horrible clarity. Miguel hadn't just stumbled into a humanitarian crisis. He'd discovered evidence of systematic murder being conducted under the cover of counter-terrorism operations. His choice to provide protection wasn't just about saving children. It was about exposing war crimes that involved his own government. Mrs. Vasquez, Dr. Okafor continued, your husband's patrol arrived 6 hours before the elimination team was scheduled to move against us. His decision to provide protection has prevented a massacre, but it has also placed American soldiers in direct opposition to intelligence operations that his own command structure may have authorized. I understood now why Colonel Harrison had been reluctant to discuss official support for any rescue operation. If American intelligence agencies were involved in planning to eliminate these children, then any military response would create a conflict between different branches of the same government. Miguel appeared beside us, his expression reflecting the same moral complexity that I was struggling to process. Elena, that's not even the worst part. When we made contact with base to report the situation, we were ordered to maintain distance and avoid involvement. Direct orders to let whatever was going to happen proceed without interference. But you didn't follow those orders. When we realized what was being planned, I made the decision to establish defensive positions and provide protection regardless of authorization. He paused, looking out at the courtyard where American soldiers were maintaining security for children whose governments wanted them dead. Elena, I know what this means for my career. I know what it means for everyone on my team. But I couldn't follow orders that would result in the murder of 50 children, regardless of who issued those orders. The scope of the moral crisis was overwhelming. Miguel and his team had been placed in a position where following orders meant complicity in war crimes, but violating orders meant ending their military careers and potentially facing court-martial for unauthorized action in foreign territory. Miguel, what kind of timeline are we looking at? Intelligence suggests the elimination team will move within the next 12 hours. They've been waiting for our patrol to be withdrawn, but since we've maintained position, they're preparing to treat us as hostile forces. The tactical situation was becoming clearer. Professional intelligence operatives would have no difficulty dealing with a single patrol of American soldiers, especially if they could claim that the soldiers had been captured or eliminated by enemy action. Miguel's team was outnumbered, outgunned, and operating without official support against people who had unlimited resources and government authorization. Have you been able to establish communication with anyone who might provide official assistance? Elena, that's the problem. We don't know which parts of our own command structure are involved in authorizing the elimination operation. Any request for support might end up providing intelligence to the people who are planning to kill these children. I spent the next hour touring the facility and interviewing both the American soldiers and the facility staff. What I learned confirmed my worst fears about the complexity of the situation, but also revealed possibilities that no one had considered. The 50 children represented intelligence assets from operations conducted by American, British, Russian, and Chinese agencies over the past 5 years. Their parents had been eliminated not because they were enemies, but because they possessed information that could expose illegal activities conducted under the cover of legitimate intelligence operations. More importantly, Dr. Okafor's organization had been documenting everything: names, dates, locations, operational details, and evidence of systematic murder conducted by intelligence agencies that were supposed to be protecting civilian populations. The children weren't just victims. They were witnesses whose testimony could bring down entire networks of people who had been using national security as cover for war crimes. Dr. Okafor, do you have copies of this documentation that could be transmitted to external oversight agencies? We have complete files on every operation that resulted in these children being orphaned. But Mrs. Vasquez, the people who are coming for us have enough authority to suppress any investigation. Evidence only matters if there are people with sufficient authority willing to act on it. That was when I realized what needed to happen. The solution wasn't military. It was political. These children didn't need to be rescued from their current location. They needed to be made so visible that eliminating them would create more problems than allowing them to live. Dr. Okafor, Miguel, I need to make a communication to base, but not through military channels. I spent the next 30 minutes composing a message that would change the entire tactical situation, not a request for military support, but a notification to civilian oversight agencies, congressional intelligence committees, and international human rights organizations. A detailed report identifying the children in the facility, documenting the elimination operations that had orphaned them, and providing evidence of systematic war crimes conducted under the cover of counterterrorism. Most importantly, I included a complete list of the 50 children by name, age, and country of origin, along with documentation of their parents' deaths. Once that information was in the hands of oversight agencies, eliminating the children would become politically impossible regardless of operational security concerns. The message took 4 hours to transmit through multiple channels, using the communication equipment Colonel Harrison had provided. By dawn, copies of the complete documentation were in the hands of people who had both the authority and the motivation to ensure that these children remained alive and protected. But as the sun rose over the compound, it became clear that the elimination team wasn't going to wait for political complications to develop. Miguel woke me from the brief rest I'd managed in one of the administrative buildings. Elena, we've got movement on all perimeters. Vehicles approaching from 3 different directions, professional coordination, and electronic warfare equipment that's disrupting our communications. I looked out the window and could see what he meant. The compound was being surrounded by people who moved with military precision and carried equipment that wasn't available to ordinary insurgent groups. These were intelligence operatives who had come prepared to eliminate everyone in the facility and make it look like a terrorist attack. How long before they're in position to begin their assault? 20 minutes, maybe 30. Elena, you need to understand something. These people aren't going to be concerned about American soldiers being in the facility. If anything, having American casualties will make their cover story more believable. The implication was clear. The elimination team was prepared to kill Miguel's patrol, along with the children and staff, then claimed that American soldiers had been captured and executed by terrorists. It would be a perfect cover story that would prevent any investigation into what had really happened. But as I watched the professional positioning of the hostile forces, I realized that they had made one critical error in their planning. They had assumed that the only people in the compound were Miguel's patrol, the facility staff, and 50 children who had no official existence. They hadn't planned for the presence of a military spouse with intelligence training who had just transmitted complete documentation of their operations to oversight agencies that were expecting regular updates on the situation. Miguel, get Dr. Okafor and gather everyone in the main building. I need to make one more transmission. The message I sent was brief, but devastating in its implications. A real-time report to congressional oversight agencies identifying the personnel who were conducting the elimination operation, their operational authorization, and the methods they were using to suppress evidence of war crimes. Most importantly, I included GPS coordinates and requested immediate satellite surveillance of the assault in progress. Within minutes, the tactical situation changed completely. Instead of conducting a covert elimination operation that would never be acknowledged, the intelligence operatives found themselves conducting an assault under direct observation by congressional oversight, international human rights monitors, and satellite surveillance systems that were recording everything. The assault team withdrew within 30 minutes of beginning their approach. Not because they weren't capable of completing their mission, but because completing their mission would now result in congressional investigations, international war crimes prosecutions, and public exposure of operations that depended on secrecy. By noon, the compound was swarming with legitimate United Nations peacekeepers, congressional investigators, and international media representatives who had been directed to the location by the oversight agencies that had received my documentation. The 50 children were officially recognized as refugees under international protection, with permanent resettlement arrangements being coordinated by agencies that could ensure their safety without requiring their continued invisibility. Miguel and his patrol were officially commended for preventing a humanitarian disaster through exceptional initiative and moral courage. Instead of facing court-martial for unauthorized action, they were recognized as examples of American military personnel who had chosen to protect innocent lives regardless of political complications. Dr. Okafor was appointed as a special advisor to international agencies investigating intelligence operations that had targeted civilian populations, with full protection and resources to continue her documentation of war crimes. And I found myself sitting in a congressional hearing room 3 weeks later, being questioned by Intelligence Committee members who were trying to understand how a military spouse with no current security clearance had managed to expose and prevent war crimes that had been authorized at the highest levels of multiple intelligence agencies. Mrs. Vasquez, can you explain how you were able to analyze this situation so accurately when trained intelligence professionals had failed to recognize the true nature of the threat? I thought about 3 years of being dismissed as just another military spouse whose only value was organizing support meetings. I thought about being underestimated by people who assumed that becoming a mother meant abandoning every other skill I'd ever developed. Congressman, I think the problem wasn't with the quality of analysis being conducted by intelligence professionals. The problem was that the people conducting the analysis were operating within systems that prevented them from recognizing certain possibilities. What do you mean by that? I mean that when you're working within official intelligence channels, you're limited to considering solutions that fit within official parameters. When you're working outside those channels, you can consider solutions that official agencies can't acknowledge, such as the possibility that the real threat to these children wasn't coming from terrorist organizations or insurgent groups, but from intelligence agencies that were supposed to be protecting civilian populations. The committee chairman leaned forward. Mrs. Vasquez, are you saying that your civilian status was actually an advantage in analyzing this situation? I'm saying that being underestimated allowed me to approach the situation without the assumptions that would have constrained official analysis. People who are dismissed as unimportant often see things that people with official authority miss. 6 months later, I was offered a position as a civilian intelligence analyst with a congressional oversight agency, responsible for investigating operations that fell outside normal accountability structures. The job came with security clearance higher than anything I'd held during my active duty service, and resources to investigate intelligence operations that officially didn't exist. But more importantly, it came with the knowledge that when 50 children needed protection from people who had unlimited authority to eliminate threats, the person who made the difference was someone everyone had written off as just another military spouse whose only skills involved organizing bake sales. Emma and Carlos adjusted remarkably well to having a mother who was no longer invisible on the base where we lived. They were proud that Mommy had helped save children, even though they couldn't understand all the details of what had happened. Miguel returned from his deployment with commendations that officially recognized his moral courage, but unofficially marked him as someone who was willing to put principle ahead of career advancement. It was a reputation that would limit certain opportunities but open others that were more important. And Dr. Okafor continued her work with international protection for displaced children, now with official recognition and unlimited resources to investigate intelligence operations that targeted civilian populations. The 50 children who had been marked for elimination were resettled in countries that could provide genuine protection, with new identities that couldn't be traced through intelligence databases and educational opportunities that would allow them to build lives that their parents had died trying to protect. But the real victory wasn't in the successful protection of 50 specific children. The real victory was in proving that intelligence agencies couldn't operate with unlimited authority to eliminate inconvenient witnesses, even when those witnesses were children whose existence had been erased from official records. The congressional investigations that followed resulted in new oversight requirements for intelligence operations, mandatory reporting procedures for operations that targeted civilian populations, and criminal prosecutions of personnel who had been using national security as cover for war crimes. Most importantly, it established the principle that being officially invisible didn't mean being unprotected, and that people who were dismissed as unimportant often possessed capabilities that were essential when official systems failed. Looking back, I realized that everything I learned about being underestimated as a military spouse prepared me for the moment when that underestimation became the most important tactical advantage available. When people assume you're not worth taking seriously, they don't prepare for the possibility that you might be the person who changes everything. They said mothers don't fight. What they didn't understand is that mothers fight for all children, not just their own. And when mothers fight, they fight with advantages that professional warriors never consider: the ability to see threats that authority figures miss, the willingness to act outside official channels when official channels fail, and the determination to protect innocence regardless of the political cost. 50 children who were supposed to disappear are now living lives that prove that sometimes the most dangerous person in any situation is the one everyone thinks is powerless. Sometimes the most effective intelligence analyst is the one who's been dismissed as just another spouse organizing potluck dinners. And sometimes the difference between systematic murder and international justice comes down to whether someone who's been underestimated for 3 years is willing to walk into hostile territory with nothing but intelligence training, communication equipment, and the certainty that protecting children is more important than following orders. 2 years after the compound incident, I was sitting in a sterile conference room in Washington, D.C., listening to Senator Patricia Hawkins explain why congressional oversight committees needed someone with my particular background to investigate intelligence operations that had gone completely off the rails. The morning briefing material spread across the table contained photographs, intercepts, and financial records that painted a picture of systematic abuse that made the children's facility case look like a minor administrative error. Elena, we're looking at a network of private intelligence contractors who have been conducting unauthorized operations in 17 countries. Operations that officially don't exist, funded through black budgets that officially don't exist, targeting people who officially don't exist. Senator Hawkins paused, studying my expression to gauge whether I understood the scope of what she was describing. The difference this time is that instead of targeting displaced children, they're targeting the intelligence analysts who have been investigating intelligence operations like the one you exposed. I felt that familiar sensation at the base of my skull, the pattern recognition that had served me well during my active duty years and had proven essential during the compound crisis. But this time, the patterns were more complex and more disturbing than anything I'd encountered before. Senator, are you telling me that intelligence agencies are systematically eliminating their own analysts to prevent exposure of unauthorized operations? I'm telling you that in the past 18 months, 14 intelligence analysts with security clearances similar to what you held during active duty have died in what appear to be random accidents. Car crashes, home invasions, medical emergencies, and equipment failures that investigation teams have concluded were unfortunate coincidences. She slid a folder across the table containing personnel files and incident reports that immediately caught my attention. The analysts who had died weren't random targets. They were people who had been investigating the same kinds of operations that had led to the creation of Dr. Okafor's facility. People who had been asking questions about missing persons, unaccounted funding, and operational authorizations that couldn't be traced through normal channels. Senator, this suggests that someone is conducting systematic elimination of oversight personnel to prevent congressional investigation of unauthorized intelligence operations. That's exactly what this suggests. And Elena, your name appeared on a target list that we intercepted 3 days ago. The weight of that information settled over me like cold water. For 2 years, I'd been working as a civilian oversight analyst, investigating intelligence operations that fell outside normal accountability structures. I'd been proud of the work, proud of the difference I was making, and proud of the respect I'd earned from people who had initially dismissed me as just another military spouse with limited qualifications. But apparently, that work had also made me a target for people who considered congressional oversight an obstacle to be eliminated, rather than a democratic necessity to be respected. What kind of timeline are we looking at? Intelligence suggests that elimination operations are conducted within 30 days of target identification. The intercept we obtained was dated 6 days ago, which means you have approximately 3 weeks before someone attempts to make your death look like an unfortunate accident. I studied the files she provided, noting operational patterns that reminded me uncomfortably of the methods that had been planned for use against the children at Dr. Okafor's facility. Professional techniques designed to eliminate targets while maintaining plausible cover stories that would prevent investigation. But there was something different about this situation that made it potentially more dangerous than what had happened at the compound. The people who had been targeting the children had been operating under official authorization from intelligence agencies that could be held accountable through congressional oversight. The people who were now targeting intelligence analysts were operating completely outside official channels, with resources that couldn't be traced and authorizations that didn't exist in any government database. Senator, do we have any intelligence about who's conducting these elimination operations? That's where it gets complicated. The operations appear to be conducted by former intelligence personnel who have been recruited by private contractors that officially don't exist. People with government training and security clearances who are being paid by organizations that have no official connection to any government agency. The implications were staggering. If former intelligence personnel were being recruited to eliminate current intelligence analysts, then the normal protective measures available to government employees wouldn't be sufficient. These people would know exactly how congressional oversight worked, exactly how protective protocols were structured, and exactly how to circumvent security measures that were designed to protect people like me. What kind of support can congressional oversight provide? Senator Hawkins was quiet for a moment, studying documents that she seemed reluctant to discuss. Elena, that's the most disturbing aspect of this situation. We have reason to believe that some of the elimination operations have been conducted with the unofficial knowledge of senior intelligence officials who consider congressional oversight a threat to national security. The scope of what she was describing was beyond anything I'd encountered during my previous intelligence work. Not just rogue operations conducted by unauthorized personnel, but systematic attacks on democratic oversight conducted by people who were supposed to be protecting American institutions. Senator, are you telling me that intelligence agencies are conducting war against congressional oversight? I'm telling you that there are people within intelligence agencies who believe that congressional oversight compromises operational security to an extent that justifies eliminating oversight personnel. People who believe that protecting classified operations is more important than protecting democratic accountability. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing intelligence reports and operational summaries that revealed the scope of what I was facing. The network of private contractors conducting elimination operations had resources that rivaled those of major intelligence agencies, with access to personnel records, surveillance capabilities, and operational funding that shouldn't have been available to private organizations. More disturbing was the evidence that these operations were being conducted with sophisticated intelligence about congressional oversight procedures, security protocols, and the personal vulnerabilities of individual analysts. Information that could only have been provided by people with access to internal congressional databases. Senator, how many people know about this briefing? 6 people, including you and me. Elena, we're operating under the assumption that normal congressional communication channels have been compromised by people who are providing intelligence to the elimination network. That meant I was essentially on my own, facing the same kind of impossible situation that Miguel had encountered at the compound. People with unlimited resources and government training were planning to eliminate me, but the normal protective measures available to government employees might not be accessible because the people providing those measures might be compromised. But it also meant that I had advantages that the elimination network might not have anticipated. 2 years of working as a congressional oversight analyst had taught me things about intelligence operations that I hadn't known during my active duty service. I understood how unauthorized operations were structured, how private contractors obtained government resources, and how elimination operations were planned and executed. Most importantly, I understood that people who conducted elimination operations depended on their targets being isolated, frightened, and unable to access resources that might provide protection. Senator, I need you to arrange a meeting with Dr. Amara Okafor, and I need access to communication equipment that can't be monitored through normal intelligence channels. Elena, what are you planning? I'm planning to do what I did at the compound. Instead of trying to hide from people who want to eliminate me, I'm going to make myself so visible that eliminating me becomes more dangerous than leaving me alone. The meeting with Dr. Okafor took place 2 days later in a secure facility that congressional oversight used for briefings that involved classified information. She looked older than when I'd last seen her at the compound, but her eyes held the same determination that had sustained her work protecting displaced children. Elena, Patricia has explained the situation you're facing. How can I help? Dr. Okafor, when we were at the compound, you had documentation that proved intelligence agencies were conducting unauthorized elimination operations. I need to know whether you've continued collecting that kind of evidence. Elena, the work I've been doing for congressional oversight has revealed systematic abuse that makes what happened at the compound look like an isolated incident. I now have documentation of elimination operations conducted in 43 countries over the past 8 years. She opened a secure briefcase containing files that were immediately recognizable as intelligence reports, operational summaries, and financial records. But the scope of what she documented was overwhelming in its implications. These files document the elimination of over 300 people who were considered security risks by various intelligence agencies, not enemy operatives or terrorist suspects, but civilians who possessed information that could expose unauthorized operations. I studied the documentation she provided, recognizing patterns that connected to the intelligence I'd received about the elimination network that was now targeting congressional oversight analysts. The same operational methods, the same funding sources, and the same kind of professional techniques that had been used against displaced children were being used against American citizens who were involved in democratic oversight. Dr. Okafor, do these files include information about the private contractors who are conducting elimination operations against oversight personnel? Elena, the contractors who are targeting you are the same people who have been conducting elimination operations for intelligence agencies for the past 8 years. The only difference is that now they're targeting the people who have been investigating their previous operations. The implications were clear. The elimination network that was planning to kill me wasn't a new organization that had been created to attack congressional oversight. It was an existing organization that had been conducting systematic murder for intelligence agencies, and congressional oversight had become a threat to their continued operations. But that also meant that all of Dr. Okafor's documentation about previous elimination operations was evidence that could be used to expose the network that was now targeting oversight analysts. Dr. Okafor, I need you to prepare complete documentation of every elimination operation you've investigated, with special attention to operations that involved intelligence analysts who were investigating unauthorized activities. Elena, that documentation could expose intelligence operations in dozens of countries. The political implications would be enormous. Dr. Okafor, the political implications of allowing intelligence agencies to eliminate congressional oversight personnel would be the end of democratic accountability for intelligence operations. We don't have a choice about whether to expose these operations. We only have a choice about whether to expose them before or after they succeed in eliminating everyone who could provide evidence. I spent the next week preparing documentation that would make it impossible for elimination operations to continue without massive political consequences. Not just evidence of operations that had been conducted against displaced children, but comprehensive proof that intelligence agencies had been systematically murdering American citizens who were involved in democratic oversight. The documentation included personnel records of the analysts who had been killed, operational reports that proved their deaths were not accidental, financial records that traced funding for elimination operations, and communication intercepts that showed coordination between intelligence agencies and private contractors. Most importantly, it included a complete organizational chart of the elimination network, with names, photographs, and operational histories of the people who were conducting systematic murder under the cover of national security. But preparing the documentation was only half of what needed to be done. The other half was ensuring that the documentation reached people who had both the authority and the motivation to act on it, regardless of political complications or intelligence agency objections. That was when I realized that the solution to my situation wasn't hiding from the elimination network or trying to outrun people with unlimited resources. The solution was making the elimination network so visible that continuing their operations would create more problems than abandoning them. I arranged simultaneous transmission of the complete documentation to congressional intelligence committees, international human rights organizations, major media outlets, and foreign intelligence agencies that had been targeted by unauthorized American operations. Within 12 hours, evidence of systematic murder conducted by American intelligence agencies was in the hands of people who could ensure that continuing elimination operations would result in congressional investigations, international prosecutions, and public exposure that would end the careers of everyone involved. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Congressional hearings were scheduled within days. International arrest warrants were issued against personnel who had been conducting elimination operations, and media coverage exposed intelligence operations that had been classified above congressional oversight levels. But the most important response came from the elimination network itself. Instead of attempting to eliminate oversight analysts who had become internationally visible, the network began eliminating its own personnel to prevent them from providing evidence that could lead to prosecutions. Within 2 weeks, 17 people who had been involved in conducting elimination operations died in what appeared to be random accidents, but which investigation teams recognized as systematic elimination of witnesses. The elimination network had been destroyed not by law enforcement action or military intervention, but by the same methods it had been using against its own targets. When exposure became more dangerous than elimination, the network chose to eliminate itself rather than face accountability for its operations. 3 months later, I was testifying before congressional committees that were investigating intelligence operations spanning 8 years and 43 countries. The scope of what had been exposed was unprecedented in the history of American intelligence oversight, but the methods I'd used to expose it were exactly the same methods I'd used to protect 50 children at Dr. Okafor's compound. Mrs. Vasquez, can you explain how you were able to neutralize an elimination network that had been operating successfully for 8 years? Congressman, the network was successful because it depended on secrecy and isolation. Targets were eliminated individually, with cover stories that prevented investigation and exposure. When those conditions were removed, when elimination operations became visible and connected, the network became more dangerous to its own personnel than to its intended targets. Are you saying that visibility was your primary defensive strategy? I'm saying that people who conduct elimination operations depend on being able to operate without accountability. When accountability becomes unavoidable, elimination operations become impossible to conduct. The congressional investigation that followed resulted in the most comprehensive reform of intelligence oversight in American history. New requirements for congressional notification of intelligence operations, mandatory reporting of operations that involved American citizens, and criminal penalties for intelligence personnel who participated in unauthorized elimination operations. But more importantly, it established the principle that intelligence agencies couldn't operate outside democratic accountability, regardless of classification levels or operational security concerns. Dr. Okafor was appointed as the director of a new international agency responsible for investigating intelligence operations that targeted civilian populations, with unlimited authority to expose operations that violated international law. Senator Hawkins was selected to chair a permanent congressional committee responsible for oversight of intelligence operations, with access to all operational records and authority to investigate any activities that appeared to violate legal or constitutional requirements. And I was offered a position as the senior analyst for congressional intelligence oversight, responsible for investigating operations that appeared to fall outside normal accountability structures. But the most important outcome was personal rather than professional. Emma and Carlos grew up understanding that their mother was someone who had changed history by refusing to accept that intelligence agencies could operate without accountability. They understood that being underestimated had been an advantage rather than a limitation, and that people who were dismissed as unimportant often possessed capabilities that were essential when official systems failed. Miguel retired from active duty and joined the congressional oversight staff as a military liaison, responsible for ensuring that oversight investigations understood operational realities that civilian analysts might miss. Together, we built lives that were defined not by the roles that other people expected us to fill, but by our willingness to act when action was necessary, regardless of personal cost or official authorization. Looking back, I realized that everything I learned about being underestimated as a military spouse prepared me for moments when that underestimation became the most important tactical advantage available. When people assume you're not capable of changing history, They don't prepare for the possibility that you might be exactly the person history has been waiting for. They said mothers don't fight. What they discovered is that mothers fight for justice, accountability, and the principle that no one is so powerful that they can operate outside democratic oversight. And when mothers fight for those principles, they fight with advantages that professional intelligence operatives never consider: the ability to see connections that authority figures miss, the willingness to expose corruption regardless of political consequences, and the determination to protect democratic institutions even when protecting them requires risking everything. The 14 intelligence analysts who had been murdered were posthumously recognized as heroes who had died defending democratic accountability. Their families received recognition that their deaths had not been accidental, and their work was continued by people who understood that congressional oversight was worth dying for. And the elimination network that had been conducting systematic murder for 8 years was completely destroyed, not by military action or law enforcement raids, but by the simple act of making their operations so visible that continuing them became impossible. Sometimes the most effective way to defeat people with unlimited resources is to remove the secrecy that makes their resources useful. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against systematic abuse is comprehensive documentation that makes denial impossible. And sometimes the difference between the survival of democratic institutions and their destruction comes down to whether someone who has been underestimated for years is willing to risk everything to prove that accountability matters more than convenience. 5 years after the congressional hearings that dismantled the elimination network, I stood in the Rose Garden watching President Martinez sign the Intelligence Accountability Act into law. The legislation represented the most comprehensive reform of American intelligence oversight since the creation of the CIA, and every provision had been shaped by evidence that Dr. Okafor and I had compiled during investigations that officially never existed until they became too big to deny. Emma, now 13, stood beside me wearing a dress she'd chosen specifically because it was the same blue as the congressional medal I'd received for exposing systematic murder within American intelligence agencies. Carlos, 11, was trying to look serious and presidential while secretly counting the number of Secret Service agents positioned around the garden. Miguel had taken leave from his position as senior military liaison to congressional oversight to attend a ceremony that recognized work he'd helped make possible through decisions that had nearly ended his career. Mrs. Vasquez, the president said as photographers captured the moment for historical records, this legislation exists because you refuse to accept that intelligence agencies could operate outside democratic accountability. The American people owe you a debt that can never be fully repaid. But as I listened to speeches about democratic values and institutional reform, I was thinking about something much simpler and more personal. I was thinking about the moment 3 years earlier, when Emma had asked me why some people had tried to kill me for doing my job, and I'd had to explain that sometimes doing the right thing makes you dangerous to people who profit from doing the wrong thing. The conversation had taken place in our kitchen at Fort Meridian, where we'd remained stationed despite offers to relocate to Washington, D.C., or assignments that would have advanced Miguel's career more rapidly. Emma had been working on a school project about American heroes, and she'd chosen to write about me, which had led to questions that were difficult to answer in ways that a 10-year-old could understand. "Mommy, why did those bad people want to hurt you?" Because I was investigating things they didn't want anyone to know about. Sometimes when you shine light on secrets that hurt people, the people who created those secrets try to stop you from telling others about them. But you told anyway. Yes, sweetheart. Because some secrets are too important to keep, even when keeping them would be safer. Emma had been quiet for a moment, processing information that most adults would find disturbing. Then she'd asked the question that had stayed with me ever since. "Mommy, are you scared that more bad people will try to hurt you?" I'd thought about lying, about giving her the kind of reassuring answer that parents usually provide when children ask about dangers they can't control. But Emma deserved the truth, even if the truth was complicated. Sometimes I am scared, but I'm more scared of what would happen if people like me stopped investigating when bad people told us to stop. I'm more scared of living in a world where intelligence agencies can eliminate anyone who asks uncomfortable questions. So you keep investigating because you're scared of what happens if you don't. I keep investigating because your father and I want you and Carlos to grow up in a country where government agencies have to follow the same laws as everyone else, even when following those laws is inconvenient or embarrassing. That conversation had taken place 6 months before the Intelligence Accountability Act was introduced in Congress, but it had shaped every decision I'd made during the legislative process that followed. Every time congressional representatives had suggested compromises that would preserve intelligence agency autonomy in exchange for limited oversight reforms, I'd thought about Emma's question and refused to accept solutions that prioritized convenience over accountability. The legislation that President Martinez signed into law required congressional notification of all intelligence operations involving American citizens, mandatory reporting of operations that resulted in civilian casualties, and criminal penalties for intelligence personnel who participated in unauthorized elimination activities. But more importantly, it established the principle that classification levels couldn't be used to prevent congressional oversight of operations that violated legal or constitutional requirements. The enforcement mechanisms were unprecedented in their scope and authority. A permanent congressional oversight committee with access to all operational records, regardless of classification levels. An independent inspector general with authority to investigate any intelligence activities without prior authorization from agency leadership. And mandatory prosecution of intelligence personnel who provided false information to oversight investigators or attempted to obstruct accountability processes. But the most significant change wasn't in the legislation itself, it was in the culture of intelligence agencies that had been forced to acknowledge that congressional oversight was a permanent feature of American democracy rather than an obstacle to be circumvented. The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate. During the 2 years between the congressional hearings and the passage of the Intelligence Accountability Act, there had been systematic resistance from intelligence personnel who considered democratic oversight incompatible with operational security. Attempts to discredit the evidence Dr. Okafor and I had compiled, efforts to classify our testimony above congressional clearance levels, and pressure campaigns designed to convince legislators that intelligence oversight reforms would compromise national security. The resistance had been professional, sophisticated, and relentless. Intelligence analysts who had worked within agencies for decades had been pressured to resign or transfer to positions where they couldn't support congressional investigations. Funding for oversight activities had been challenged through bureaucratic procedures that were designed to delay implementation of accountability measures. And media campaigns had been conducted to convince the public that intelligence oversight reforms would provide operational intelligence to foreign adversaries. But the resistance had also revealed the extent to which intelligence agencies had been operating outside legal and constitutional boundaries. Every attempt to prevent congressional oversight had provided additional evidence that oversight was necessary, and every effort to classify evidence of systematic abuse had demonstrated that classification was being used to prevent accountability rather than protect legitimate operational security. The breakthrough had come when Senator Hawkins arranged for Dr. Okafor to testify before the full Senate Intelligence Committee about elimination operations that had been conducted against American citizens. Her testimony had been classified at the highest levels, but the senators who heard it had been shocked by evidence that American intelligence agencies had been systematically murdering their own citizens to prevent exposure of unauthorized operations. Within days, legislation had been introduced that would have been politically impossible just months earlier. Not compromise measures that preserved intelligence agency autonomy while creating the appearance of oversight, but comprehensive reforms that established genuine accountability for intelligence operations. The legislative process had taken 18 months. But the final bill had passed with bipartisan support that reflected congressional recognition that intelligence oversight was essential to American democratic institutions. President Martinez finished his remarks and handed me the pen he'd used to sign the legislation. It was a symbolic gesture, but one that recognized my role in making comprehensive intelligence reform politically possible. As we walked back toward the White House, Dr. Okafor joined our family group. She was now the director of the International Intelligence Accountability Agency, a position that gave her authority to investigate intelligence operations conducted by any government that participated in international intelligence sharing agreements. Elena, do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd chosen to stay safe instead of getting involved? I thought about the question as we watched Emma and Carlos running across the White House lawn, chasing each other in games that reflected the kind of childhood security that comes from living in a country where government agencies are held accountable for their actions. Dr. Okafor, I think about it every day. But then I think about what would have happened to those 50 children if Miguel had chosen to follow orders instead of protecting them. And I think about what would have happened to congressional oversight if we'd chosen to hide instead of making intelligence operations visible. And I realize that the most dangerous choice is usually the choice to do nothing when action is necessary. The people who tried to eliminate us were counting on us choosing safety over accountability. They were counting on us being too scared or too isolated to fight back. But we weren't. We weren't. And that made all the difference. The years following the passage of the Intelligence Accountability Act had brought changes that extended far beyond congressional oversight of American intelligence agencies. The evidence we'd compiled during our investigations had been shared with international accountability organizations, leading to similar reforms in intelligence oversight systems throughout Europe, Asia, and South America. More importantly, the precedent we'd established had made it politically impossible for intelligence agencies in democratic countries to conduct elimination operations against their own citizens. The systematic murder that had been standard practice for decades had become too risky to continue, not because of law enforcement pressure, but because of public awareness that made denial impossible. The transformation hadn't eliminated intelligence operations that violated international law, but it had made such operations significantly more difficult to conduct and impossible to conceal. Intelligence agencies that had operated with unlimited authority now faced genuine oversight from democratic institutions that had both the authority and the motivation to hold them accountable for their actions. The personal cost had been significant but manageable. Death threats from intelligence personnel who considered me a traitor to national security interests. Surveillance activities that were designed to intimidate my family and monitor our daily activities. And career limitations that reflected the reality that people who expose government corruption rarely receive promotions within government agencies. But the personal benefits had far exceeded the costs. Recognition from congressional leaders who understood that democratic accountability depended on people who were willing to risk everything to expose systematic abuse. Respect from international human rights organizations that viewed our work as essential to protecting civilian populations from intelligence operations. And most importantly, the knowledge that Emma and Carlos were growing up in a country where intelligence agencies couldn't eliminate people who asked uncomfortable questions. Miguel had thrived in his role as military liaison to congressional oversight, where his experience at the compound had made him uniquely qualified to help civilian investigators understand operational realities that shaped intelligence activities. His willingness to choose principle over career advancement had marked him as someone who could be trusted with oversight responsibilities that required moral courage rather than institutional loyalty. The work had also brought unexpected opportunities for family involvement in democratic institutions. Emma had developed an interest in constitutional law that reflected her understanding that government accountability was essential to protecting individual rights. Carlos had become fascinated with international relations, particularly the ways that accountability mechanisms could prevent governments from conducting operations that violated their own citizens' rights. But the most important outcome had been personal rather than professional. The knowledge that when systematic abuse threatened democratic institutions, we had chosen to fight rather than accommodate. The knowledge that when intelligence agencies had attempted to eliminate oversight personnel, we had made elimination operations more dangerous to their perpetrators than to their intended targets. Looking back, I realized that everything I'd learned about being underestimated as a military spouse had prepared me for moments when that underestimation became the most important strategic advantage available. When people assume you're not capable of changing history, they don't prepare for the possibility that you might be exactly the person history has been waiting for. The compound incident had taught me that mothers fight for all children, not just their own. The congressional oversight work had taught me that democratic accountability depends on people who are willing to risk everything to expose systematic abuse. And the Intelligence Accountability Act had taught me that comprehensive reform was possible when evidence of abuse became impossible to deny. But the most important lesson had been simpler and more personal. The lesson that being dismissed as unimportant was often an advantage rather than a limitation, and that people who were underestimated often possessed capabilities that were essential when official systems failed. As we left the White House that afternoon, Emma asked me a question that reflected her growing understanding of the work that had shaped our family's life for the past 5 years. "Mommy, do you think there are still bad people in intelligence agencies who want to hurt people who investigate them?" I thought about the question as we walked toward the car that would take us back to Fort Meridian, where I would continue working as a senior analyst for congressional intelligence oversight. Yes, sweetheart. There are still people who believe that protecting secrets is more important than protecting people. But there are also laws now that make it much harder for them to hurt people who ask uncomfortable questions. And there are people like your father and me and Dr. Okafor who are watching to make sure those laws are enforced. So the bad people can't eliminate investigators anymore? They can try, but it's much more dangerous for them now. When elimination operations become visible, they create more problems than they solve. When accountability becomes unavoidable, systematic abuse becomes impossible to sustain. Emma was quiet for a moment, processing implications that most adults would find challenging. Then she asked the question that summarized everything I'd learned about fighting systematic abuse within democratic institutions. "Mommy, does that mean you won?" I thought about 50 children who were now living lives that their parents had died trying to protect. I thought about 14 intelligence analysts whose deaths had been acknowledged as murders rather than accidents. I thought about systematic accountability measures that had made intelligence operations subject to democratic oversight for the first time in American history. "Emma, I think it means we proved that mothers do fight. We proved that being underestimated can be an advantage rather than a limitation. And we proved that people who are dismissed as unimportant often possess capabilities that are essential when justice depends on someone being willing to risk everything to expose the truth." "So you did win." "Yes, sweetheart. We won. Not just for our family, but for everyone who believes that government agencies should be held accountable for their actions. We won for everyone who believes that democratic oversight is more important than operational convenience." As we drove through Washington, D.C. toward the airport that would take us home to Fort Meridian, I reflected on the journey that had begun with a routine patrol gone wrong and had ended with the most comprehensive reform of American intelligence oversight in history. The journey had been defined not by the roles that other people expected me to fill, but by my willingness to act when action was necessary, regardless of personal cost or official authorization. It had been shaped by the understanding that being underestimated was often an advantage rather than a limitation, and that people who were dismissed as unimportant often possessed capabilities that were essential when official systems failed. But most importantly, it had been guided by the principle that protecting children and preserving democratic accountability were responsibilities that transcended career considerations, personal safety, and institutional loyalty. They said mothers don't fight. What they discovered is that when democratic institutions are threatened by systematic abuse, when children are targeted for elimination by intelligence agencies, when congressional oversight is compromised by people who consider accountability incompatible with operational security, mothers fight with advantages that professional intelligence operatives never consider. We fight with the ability to see patterns that authority figures miss. We fight with the willingness to expose corruption regardless of political consequences. We fight with the determination to protect democratic institutions even when protecting them requires risking everything we've built. And when mothers fight for justice, accountability, and the principle that no one is so powerful that they can operate outside democratic oversight, we fight until systematic abuse becomes too dangerous to continue, and comprehensive reform becomes politically inevitable. The 50 children who were supposed to disappear are now adults who understand that their survival depended on people who were willing to choose principle over safety. The intelligence accountability measures that were supposed to be impossible are now permanent features of American democratic institutions. And the elimination network that was supposed to be untouchable was completely destroyed by the simple act of making their operations too visible to deny. Sometimes the most effective way to defeat people with unlimited resources is to remove the secrecy that makes their resources useful. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against systematic abuse is comprehensive documentation that makes denial impossible. And sometimes the difference between the survival of democratic institutions and their destruction comes down to whether someone who has been underestimated for years is willing to prove that accountability matters more than convenience. That's the story of how they said mothers don't fight, then learned that when 50 children needed protection from intelligence agencies that wanted them dead, when 14 analysts needed justice for murders that were disguised as accidents, when democratic oversight needed defenders who couldn't be intimidated by people with unlimited authority, the person who made the difference was someone everyone had dismissed as just another military spouse whose only skills involved organizing support meetings. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. The compound hadn't been built recently. It had been there for over a year, but someone had been very careful to keep it off official databases. The construction materials had been sourced through a network of shell companies that traced back to defense contractors with access to American military specifications. And the timing of the patrol's capture wasn't random. "Colonel," I said finally, looking up from the intelligence reports, "I don't think this is a hostage situation. I think this is recruitment." "Explain." The pattern suggests that whoever is running this operation has been studying American military procedures for months, not to attack us, but to identify personnel with specific skill sets. Your husband's unit includes specialists in communications, explosive ordnance disposal, and advanced weapons systems. That's not a random capture, that's a shopping list. Colonel Harrison frowned. You're saying they targeted the 3rd Battalion specifically for their technical expertise? I'm saying they targeted them because someone provided detailed information about each soldier's capabilities and clearance levels. Someone who had access to personnel files and deployment schedules. Someone who knew exactly when and where the patrol would be vulnerable. The implications of what I was suggesting hung in the air like smoke. If I was right, then the hostage situation was actually an inside operation designed to acquire American military personnel with specialized skills. And if I was right, then a standard rescue operation would play directly into their hands. Mrs. Vasquez, Colonel Harrison said slowly, if your analysis is correct, then we need to approach this situation very differently than we initially planned. Yes, sir. And we need to approach it quickly, because every hour those soldiers are in there, they're being evaluated for usefulness. The ones who don't meet their criteria. I didn't finish the sentence, but I didn't need to. What do you recommend? For the first time in 3 years, someone was asking for my professional opinion on a matter of life and death. Someone was treating me like the intelligence analyst I'd been, rather than just the military spouse I'd become. And as I looked at the satellite photos of the compound where my husband was being held, I realized that everything I'd learned about being underestimated was about to become the most important tactical advantage we had. The compound has been operating for over a year, but it only appeared on our radar after the patrol was taken. That suggests they've been deliberately staying below our detection threshold while caring for displaced children. Colonel Harrison rubbed his forehead. So what changed? Why surface now? That was the question that had been nagging at me since I'd started analyzing the situation. Why would a facility that had successfully avoided attention suddenly expose itself by capturing American soldiers? The answer came to me with the force of cold certainty. Because someone was coming for the children, someone with enough resources and inside information to threaten a facility that had been safely hidden for a year. The patrol wasn't captured, it was recruited. Our soldiers are there because whoever runs that compound needed American military protection to defend against a threat they couldn't handle alone. The implications hit the room like a physical force. If I was right, then 12 American soldiers weren't hostages, but volunteers, in an unauthorized protection mission. If I was right, then the real enemy wasn't the people holding our patrol, but whoever had forced them to take such desperate action. Mrs. Vasquez, Colonel Harrison said slowly, that would mean our soldiers are currently engaged in an unsanctioned military operation on foreign soil without command authorization. Yes, sir. And it would mean that any rescue operation we launch might end up attacking the wrong people. Major Davidson was already pulling up additional intelligence reports. If there's a third-party threat, we should have some indication in our surveillance data. I spent the next hour reviewing everything we had, but this time looking for evidence of external threats rather than focusing on the compound itself. What I found made my blood run cold. 3 days before the patrol went missing, satellite imagery showed increased vehicle traffic in the region. Not random movement, but coordinated deployment of personnel and equipment. The vehicles weren't standard insurgent transportation. They were too new, too well-maintained, too professionally organized. More disturbing was the communication intelligence from the same time period. Encrypted transmissions using frequencies typically associated with private military contractors, all originating from a location approximately 20 kilometers from the compound. The timing suggested that someone had been planning an operation against the children's facility, and someone else had learned about it in time to arrange protection. Colonel, I said, looking up from the reports, I think our soldiers stumbled into the middle of someone else's war. The compound requested help, probably through unofficial channels, and the patrol commander made a field decision to provide protection against an incoming threat. That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Vasquez. You're suggesting that Sergeant Vasquez and his team violated direct orders to engage in unauthorized military action. The formal use of Miguel's rank and name hit me like a physical blow. My husband wasn't just another soldier in this situation. He was the patrol leader who would have made the decision to deviate from mission parameters. If my analysis was correct, then Miguel had chosen to protect children over following orders, and that choice could cost him his career even if we got everyone out alive. Sir, I'm suggesting that when American soldiers are faced with a choice between following procedures and protecting children, they're trained to choose protecting children, even if it means taking risks that command wouldn't authorize. Colonel Harrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the intelligence reports and thermal imaging data. Finally, he spoke in a voice that carried the weight of command decision. Mrs. Vasquez, if your analysis is correct, then we have a tactical situation that falls outside standard operational parameters. We can't launch a rescue operation against people who are protecting American soldiers, but we also can't officially acknowledge an unauthorized protection mission. What does that mean practically, sir? It means we need someone who can get inside that compound, assess the actual situation, and coordinate whatever response is necessary without official military involvement. Someone who can make contact with our personnel and determine whether they need extraction or support. I felt the trajectory of the conversation with growing certainty about where it was heading. There were only a few ways to get inside a fortified compound without triggering defensive responses, and most of them required someone who didn't look like a military threat. Sir, are you asking me to volunteer for an infiltration mission? Mrs. Vasquez, I'm asking you to consider whether your unique combination of intelligence training and civilian status might allow you to accomplish something that conventional military approaches can't. The weight of what he was suggesting settled over me like a cold blanket. They wanted me to leave the safety of the base, travel into hostile territory, and somehow get inside a compound where 12 American soldiers were engaged in an unauthorized mission to protect displaced children. They wanted me to risk everything on the chance that my analysis was correct and that whoever was inside would trust a military spouse enough to let her help. But as I looked at the thermal imaging showing those 38 small heat signatures clustered in protective buildings, I realized that my children were safe on this base, while other children were counting on people like Miguel to keep them alive. I realized that for 3 years, I'd been complaining about being underestimated, while doing nothing to prove that the estimation was wrong. What kind of support would I have? Colonel Harrison exchanged glances with Major Davidson before answering. Officially none. This conversation never happened, and any action you take would be entirely civilian in nature. Unofficially, we'd provide transportation to the general area, communication equipment, and extraction resources if you can get our people to a secure location. And if something goes wrong, then you're a military spouse who got lost during a base tour and ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. The military would have no knowledge of your activities and no responsibility for the consequences. Complete deniability. They were asking me to volunteer for a mission so far outside official parameters that they'd have to disavow any knowledge if it failed. They were asking me to trust my analysis enough to bet my life on it, and to trust my husband enough to believe he'd made the right choice even if it violated every regulation in the book. I thought about Emma and Carlos, safe in the base childcare center, drawing pictures and playing games while their father was involved in something that could end his military career. I thought about 38 children who were depending on American soldiers to protect them from people with enough resources to threaten a hidden facility. I thought about 3 years of being dismissed as just another military spouse whose only value was organizing potluck dinners. I'll need 6 hours to arrange childcare and prepare a cover story. Colonel Harrison nodded. Transportation leaves at 1,800 hours. Mrs. Vasquez, I want to be clear about something. What you're volunteering for isn't a military mission. It's a personal choice to help American personnel who may be in danger. The fact that you're the most qualified person available doesn't change the fact that you're under no obligation to accept this risk. Sir, with respect, when someone threatens children, obligation doesn't factor into the equation. The only question is whether you're capable of helping or not. I spent the rest of the afternoon making arrangements that would allow me to disappear from base routine without triggering immediate searches. Linda would cover my FRG duties for the next 2 days, with a cover story about a family emergency requiring travel. The childcare center would extend Emma and Carlos's stay through the overnight program, with notification that their mother was dealing with a personal situation. The hardest part was recording a video message for my children, just in case. Sitting in my base housing kitchen, looking at the camera on my phone, trying to find words that would explain why Mommy had made a choice that might mean she wouldn't come home. Emma, Carlos, if you're watching this, it means that Mommy had to go help Daddy with something very important. You know how we've talked about how sometimes people have to make difficult choices to help others? Sometimes grown-ups have to do things that are scary, because it's the right thing to do. I want you to remember that your father and I love you more than anything in the world, and that everything we do is to make sure you're safe, and that other children can be safe too. I recorded 3 different versions before I found one that didn't sound like a goodbye. At 1,700 hours, I changed into civilian clothes that would allow me to blend into local populations. Dark pants, long-sleeve shirt, headscarf that could be adjusted based on cultural requirements. Nothing that would immediately identify me as American military or as someone with intelligence training. The communication equipment was disguised as commercial electronics. A cell phone with satellite uplink capability, a portable charger that was actually a GPS beacon, and a tablet loaded with maps and translation software. To anyone who searched me, I'd look like a lost tourist with standard electronic devices. The most important item was a sealed envelope containing documents that would support my cover story. Tourist visa, travel itinerary, hotel reservations, and family photos that portrayed me as a civilian visitor who'd gotten separated from a tour group. The documents were sophisticated enough to pass casual inspection, but not sophisticated enough to raise questions about who had produced them. Major Davidson met me at the vehicle staging area as the sun was setting. The transportation was a civilian contractor vehicle that regularly moved between bases and local communities, nothing that would attract attention or suggest military involvement. Mrs. Vasquez, once you leave this base, you're on your own until you make contact with our personnel or request extraction. Are you certain about this? I thought about Miguel making a similar choice 3 days ago, deciding to protect children instead of following safe procedures. I thought about 38 small heat signatures clustered in buildings where American soldiers were providing protection against unknown threats. Major, I'm certain that if American soldiers are protecting children, then they need whatever support they can get, even if that support comes from someone everyone thinks is just a military spouse who organizes bake sales. The drive to the drop-off point took 2 hours through terrain that became increasingly desolate as we moved away from established military zones. The contractor driver was professional and silent, asking no questions about why a civilian was being transported to coordinates that weren't associated with any known facilities. As we approached the drop-off location, I could see lights in the distance that marked the compound where my husband and 11 other soldiers were involved in an unauthorized mission to protect displaced children. Between my position and those lights lay 15 kilometers of hostile territory, potential enemy forces, and the most important decision of my life. The driver stopped at a crossroads marked only by a damaged road sign and a few scattered buildings that had been abandoned months earlier. This is as close as I can get safely. From here, you're walking. I shouldered the pack containing my supplies and communication equipment, checked the GPS coordinates one final time, and started walking toward a confrontation that would either prove my analysis correct or end with consequences I didn't want to consider. The night air was cold and clear, with enough moonlight to navigate without artificial illumination. As I walked, I reviewed everything I knew about the situation and tried to prepare for possibilities that my intelligence training couldn't fully predict. If I was right about the compound being a children's facility, then approaching it would require demonstrating that I wasn't a threat. If I was right about Miguel's patrol providing protection, then making contact would require convincing American soldiers that I was there to help rather than to extract them against their will. But if I was wrong about any of it, then I was walking into a hostage situation with no backup, no authority, and no guarantee that anyone would even know what had happened to me. 2 hours into the walk, I saw the first signs that my analysis might be correct. Fresh tire tracks and patterns that suggested defensive positioning rather than random vehicle placement. Communication equipment that had been placed to provide coverage of approaches to the compound. Security measures that were designed to detect threats while avoiding engagement unless necessary. This wasn't the setup for holding hostages. This was the setup for protecting something valuable against incoming attack. As I got closer to the compound walls, I could see the thermal signatures Major Davidson had shown me translated into reality. Lights in windows where caretakers were maintaining normal routines, the sound of children's voices carrying faintly across the distance. The controlled movement of people who were going about their daily lives under protection, rather than living in fear. But I could also see other signs that confirmed my worst fears about external threats. Vehicle positions that weren't part of the compound's security but appeared to be surveillance posts. Movement patterns in the surrounding terrain that suggested hostile observation rather than friendly patrol. Someone was watching the compound, waiting for an opportunity to move against the children inside. And Miguel's patrol was all that stood between 38 displaced children and people who had enough resources and inside information to threaten a facility that had successfully hidden for over a year. I was 50 meters from the compound walls when the voice called out in English, professional and alert, but not immediately hostile. "Stop where you are. Identify yourself and state your business." The voice belonged to an American soldier maintaining perimeter security, someone who was following protective protocols rather than hostage-taking procedures. Someone who was treating me as a potential threat to the people inside rather than as a potential victim to be captured. "My name is Elena Vasquez. I'm here about Sergeant Miguel Vasquez and the 12 soldiers who are providing protection for this facility." There was a long pause. Then a different voice. One I recognized even across the distance and through the stress of the situation. "Elena? What the hell are you doing here?" My husband's voice, filled with equal parts relief and horror at seeing me in a place where I definitely wasn't supposed to be. The voice of someone who'd made an impossible choice and was living with the consequences. "Miguel, I'm here because Colonel Harrison sent me to find out what's really happening. And because someone needs to know that you and your team aren't the only ones interested in what happens to those children." The compound gate opened, and I found myself looking at my husband for the first time in 3 months. He was wearing combat gear, carrying weapons, and positioned like someone who'd been expecting trouble for days. But his eyes held the same mixture of determination and concern that I'd seen the night he'd deployed, when he'd promised to come home safe but admitted he couldn't promise the world would be safe enough to let him. "Elena, you shouldn't be here. This situation is more complicated than anyone at base realizes." "I know. That's why I'm here." I looked past him to the compound where lights in the windows revealed the silhouettes of children being prepared for bed by adults who were trying to maintain normal routines under extraordinary circumstances. "Miguel, I need you to tell me exactly what happened 3 days ago. And I need you to tell me why you decided that protecting these children was worth risking everything." As I walked through the compound gates, I realized that everything I'd learned about being underestimated as a military spouse was about to be tested in ways that would determine whether 12 American soldiers would be court-martialed for unauthorized action, whether 38 children would survive the night, and whether a woman who'd spent 3 years organizing potluck dinners could prove that mothers don't just fight for their own children. They fight for all children, even when it means walking into hostile territory with no backup and no guarantee of survival. Miguel led me through the compound's main courtyard, where I could see the reality of what my thermal imaging analysis had only suggested. This wasn't a makeshift hostage facility or a terrorist stronghold. It was a functioning children's home, complete with play areas, educational spaces, and sleeping quarters that had been maintained with care despite the surrounding chaos. But it was also clearly under siege. American soldiers were positioned at strategic points throughout the facility, not as captors but as defenders. I could see Specialist Martinez monitoring communication equipment that had been set up to coordinate defensive positions. Corporal Johnson was reviewing security footage from cameras that covered all approaches to the compound. These weren't the actions of captured personnel. These were the actions of soldiers who had chosen to make a stand. "Miguel, start from the beginning. What happened during your patrol?" He guided me toward a building that served as a temporary command center, where maps and intelligence reports were spread across tables that had probably been used for children's homework just days earlier. We were following standard patrol routes when we intercepted communications suggesting an imminent attack on civilian targets in this area. Intelligence indicated the targets were displaced persons camps, but when we investigated, we found this facility. I studied the maps he showed me, recognizing tactical markings that indicated defensive planning rather than offensive operations.